This is the second video that I'm doing to help with flashcards for histology. In the last video, we covered epithelial tissues where we differentiate between one and more than one layer epithelial tissues, simple and stratified. And we covered simple squamous tissue by looking at the alveoli of the lung. We looked at simple columnar tissue, looking at the intestines. We also covered exocrine and endocrine glands. We looked at a salivary gland of a mouse, and for the exocrine gland, we looked at a sweat gland on scalp tissue. And then finally, also stratified squamous we covered by looking at the esophagus or skin. So remember, the one nice thing about epithelial tissues is that as long as you can tell if they're simple, one layer, or stratified, more than one layer, and you can identify squamous, cuboidal, and columnar shaped cells, they're actually pretty easy to differentiate from one another. We're now going to be moving to connective tissues, though, of which we have four of them that we're going to be looking at. Oh, sorry, five. We're going to be looking at reticular connective tissue, that's bone marrow. We're going to be looking at bone itself, bone tissue, sorry, blood tissue, adipose, which is body fat tissue, and then we're also going to be looking at one type of cartilage. That's the only one that we have, and that is hyaline cartilage. So I'm going to try to differentiate between those. Now, keep in mind, though, this is not going to be quite as simple as looking for layering and cell shape, but I do think that each of these five are different enough that they will be pretty easy to differentiate. So I'm going to just pull my iPad up here on the screen. Just give me one sec. And then we will take a look. All right. So the first tissue that I have up here is actually adipose tissue. Now, the one thing I want to point out, remember, again, up here in the corner, I'm going to show you what the zoom is. I don't think I have any other zooms for this one. I don't. But this one could be zoomed at 40x. It could also be zoomed at 400x. And what you're going to see is this honeycomb-like appearance. Now, this is, again, kind of pixelated because the scope camera that I use, remember, has pretty low resolution. I will say, though, when you're looking at these in lab, they probably won't even look this good. I know it's kind of shocking to think that looks good, but you will see this honeycomb-like appearance, but it is going to look almost invisible. So my rule of thumb to students is always, if you sit down at a microscope and what you see it looks to be invisible, that's because you're probably looking at body fat. And remember, if you think back just to last unit when we did biochemistry, lipids, by definition, are hydrophobic. They repel water. And the stain actually that you see, this purple stain, which I actually think is saccharin blue, this purple stain is adhering to the only hydrophilic part of the cell, which are the phosphate heads in the plasma membrane. So you can actually just see the dyeing of the plasma membrane for all of these cells. The rest of the cell is pretty much one entire big lipid droplet. And so stain doesn't stick to it, kind of like oil and water don't mix. So what I had to do in order to get this picture actually was to lower the diaphragm, the condenser in the microscopes, to let in as little light as possible. And I also had to put a piece of like dark tissue paper over the light source to shade it enough in order to be able to see this. So again, if you sit down at a microscope and you can't really see anything, if you think you can't see anything, look closely and you will see this honeycomb-like effect. That is very, very indicative of adipose tissue. So there's not really much for me to label in here. If you're labeling something on your flashcards, I might just, if I were you, I would just outline the plasma membrane maybe. So let me get rid of that. Sorry. So maybe just outline the fact that this is all plasma membrane. And you can shade a couple cells in. So plasma membrane. And that's the only part that's going to be dyed. The rest of it in this picture, the center part, right there, right, that's all lipid substance. That's why it's not dyed. So, okay. So if I'm labeling some things on the back here, so the specific tissue here is adipose. Remember, adipose is body fat, but I do want you to know the technical term, adipose. The main tissue type now is connective. So we covered epithelial tissues last time. We're covering connective tissues this time. Location on the body, any place you find body fat. I mean, it's sort of everywhere. I'm just going to put your love handles just for fun. And then body fat has so many functions. I'm just going to list a couple. Cushioning, heat, to help generate heat or warmth. I'll just put warmth as well. It's also there as long-term energy storage. Not short-term energy storage, because that is what glycogen, a carbohydrate, does in our muscles, recall. But long-term energy storage we store as fat, kind of like how bears store up a bunch of fat, or bats store up a bunch of fat in preparation for hibernation. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that body fat does that you should probably know of. Cushion, heat, warmth, long-term energy storage. I think that's pretty good. And then is there any other important notes? I'm just going to put down a little star here and remind you that this is difficult to see. And that's difficult to see, recall, because the stain does not adhere well to, I'm just going to say the water-based. Whoops. Doesn't adhere well to fat. All right, so that's one down already. Pretty easy, I think. Adipose. Whoops, sorry about that. It's one down. That's our adipose, this little honeycomb-like thing. So, all right, now you'll be able to see there's quite a big difference between this one looks really terrible, really pixelated. So I'm going to go zoom all the way in. Notice I'm starting at 40 times zoom here, which really looks quite terrible. It almost looks like, you know, old-fashioned cathode ray tube television when you get the static on the TV. This maybe looks a little bit better. In this picture, you can kind of start to see these little purple dots. I'm trying to shade them in here for you. Do you see what I'm pointing to there, those purple dots? There's a couple other big ones. All right, so those are going to be important as I point out on the next slide. So I'm going to keep going here. All right, so you could see a purple dot now here. Let me close this. All right, so I'm going to make these purple dots really big. And I would suggest that you shade in a couple of these big purple dots as well. So right now I can only really see 2 of these. Now the other thing I'd like you to do on your flashcard is to color in some of these red dots. These do look a little bit pinkish here. Now they look about the same size as the purple dots. They're not. They're much smaller. The problem is there are just so many of them that they're piled on top of each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a couple of them here. And if you haven't figured it out already, this is blood. Now, again, as you learned on your brace map, blood, the majority of all connective tissues, recall, is non-living. It's this extracellular matrix. And then blood, that's really, really straightforward. That is blood plasma. So all the white stuff that you're seeing here is not just a microscope slide, right? This would be plasma between the cells. The majority of your blood is blood plasma. And then we're going to have white blood cells. White blood cells have a lot of protein in their outer coating. And so they dye really, really deep purple when they're dyed. And then the rest that you're seeing here are the red blood cells, which are significantly smaller. So white blood cells are big and fluffy and have a really thick, remember, coating on the outside of them. And then the red blood cells are much smaller. So I do want you to know the scientific names of these, which were in the cells unit. So I'm just going to remind you of those when we're labeling that on the back. So that's why we color coordinated it. So I'm going to scroll down now and we're going to start talking a little bit about blood. So the specific tissue here is blood, of course. Main tissue type again is connective. Sorry. Location on the body. You have blood all over your body. We could say where it's made. It's made in your bones, technically in the bone marrow, and found in cardiovascular system. Okay, functions of blood. Blood primarily has so many functions. I'm going to lump it into the two that we're going to be talking about with these cells, with the purple and the red cells. So red blood cells, sole function is to carry oxygen. That is all it does. It's a vehicle for oxygen. White blood cells are there to fight pathogens. Okay, so important notes. Absolutely, let's talk cells here. So I'm going to start with our white blood cells. I'm going to make them big and purple. And I want you to remember that these are called leukocytes. And these are the white blood cells. And the little red dots, these are erythrocytes, or red blood cells. So you will have to know both of those for the lab practical, red blood cells and white blood cells, and you will have to know them by their scientific names. So just making sure that we practice those a little bit. All right, now we're 2 down. Let's move on to bone tissue. Now, I want to say a little bit about bone tissue. You actually have one, there's a lot of slides here. You have one flashcard that covers both of these. I believe your flashcard has this one, and it also has this one. Okay, so that's the one you should be looking for. While you're looking at your flashcard, I just want to talk about a couple of things. Okay, I'm going to actually go down. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to go to the back of the flashcard right away. So once you find the flashcard that has this part and this on it, flip it over, and I'm going to talk about what you're seeing here. Because first, I want to differentiate that there is a difference between a bone, the organ, and bone tissue, right? Organs, remember, are made up of many tissues, whereas tissues are made up of many cells. So bone and organ, the organ called a bone, actually has multiple tissues in it, right? The blood, which is a separate tissue we just talked about, is formed within. Actually, let me draw a bone here for you. All right, just like that. And then bone has a bunch of different parts to it, but one thing that I think most people know about bones is that they are spongy on the inside. So if you've ever seen like a dog bone or anything like that, right? They have this hard, compact outside. We actually call that compact bone. And then they have this spongy middle, the center, where the bone marrow is, and that's called spongy bone. What you are actually seeing on this right up here is a little piece of compact bone right here, and this right here is the spongy bone. So you are seeing a piece of a long bone. You can't fit an entire bone on a microscope slide, so they couldn't show you the whole thing. So what they're really showing you, if I outline it here, what they're showing you is like maybe this, right? Just cut out. So that's what's on your flashcard on the opposite side, just a piece of this long bone with the bone marrow center and then the compact outside. You're also seeing bone tissue though in this one right here, but what you're looking at is much more magnified. Notice it's 400 times magnification versus The other picture right here is only 40 times. So we're going 10 times bigger. And what we're zooming in on now is where the actual cells within bone tissue live. So we're actually zooming in on this compact bone right here. So I'm going to try to differentiate and make more sense of this in just a second, but it is important to know that even though both of these, this one zoomed all the way in, this is just zoomed out even more. So you'll notice right here, whoops, this right here, and actually, maybe I can have you draw something once you flip it over. If you have red, if you shade in the middle here, this is where a blood vessel would be. So this thing right here is actually called a central canal. Not the blood vessel, but the tunnel. The central canal tunnel carries blood throughout bone tissue. And if you ever fracture or break a bone, right, that's what causes a hematoma and blood to rush through the bone and start to swell up and so on and so forth. But it also causes it to start healing, rushing calcium and other things to the fracture site. Now, other things that you can see here, and I'm going to kind of cheat because I can cover up what's underneath it. You can see these really large black spots on bone tissue. And so these are actually cavities. They're actually big holes, like little pores inside of bone. I'm going to shade them in yellow so that I can put something else in them. Just going to do a few here. All right. These little cavities are where bone cells actually live. I'm going to make bone cells green. It's going to be a Packer thing, I guess. Right, this little green dot. All right. So these green things are bone cells. Versus the yellow dots are cavities. I don't know if you can read that, cavity. So the reason bone cells have to be growing inside of a cavity is, and this is a really macabre example, but imagine a little baby was just born and we put that living baby inside of a little, a little bathtub and we poured concrete over the baby. But, we're not terrible people. And so we give the baby a feeding tube and so the baby can breathe. I hope we can all agree that that baby would still die, right? And it's not because we're not feeding the baby or we're not allowing the baby to breathe oxygen, but because babies need space to grow, right? Babies need other things too, of course. But bone cells are also going to need space to grow, and they can't grow in bone tissue itself because the rest of what you're seeing here, all this white stuff within bone tissue, this is all calcium salt. Here, let's label that. This is calcium and this is phosphorus. And this is essentially as hard as cement, right? I mean, just knock on one of your bones right now, right? Knock on your kneecap. That's hard stuff. And so bone cells cannot grow in cement as in this calcium phosphorus matrix. There's actually that matrix is called hydroxyapatite. They can't grow in there. So to give them some space to grow, they're growing in these little teeny holes in the bone, these little teeny cavities, which I'm going to name in a second because they have a special name. And then they're constantly fed blood because what you can't see in this picture is there are tiny little capillaries that run through these little canals as well that are connect to these little cavities and feed the cells inside, feed them nutrients, kind of like our little feeding tube that I just made a horrible reference to with our baby just a second ago. So I'm going to talk about all of those, and you're going to learn them later too when we get to the skeletal system. These are actually called perforating canals as opposed to a central canal. So let's label a couple of those things now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my same colors, and I'm going to say that our big cavity, that is called a lacuna. One of them is called a lacuna. If we're talking about more than one, we put an E at the end, and it's called lacunae, kind of like an antenna or antennae on an insect. And then you have the little green dot, right? Those little bone cells, right? That thing right there. A bone cell is, remember, appropriately called an osteocyte. literally meaning bone cell. Osteo meaning bone, site cell. So that's a bone cell. And then, was there anything else I put on there? I don't think so. Well, we labeled the rest. So you will need to know those terms as well. And then the only other thing that I want to talk about, well, I already talked about compact bone and spongy bone. Oh, okay. The only other thing is that I want to talk about is there's actually two tissues in this slide, not just bone tissue. Bone tissue is where compact bone is. So let me get a different color here. So this is going to be our bone tissue. This compact bone right here is technically bone tissue. But within bone marrow, right down here, and I know it's a little hard to see that. Within bone marrow, this spongy part right here, it's also called spongy bone, remember? This is actually its own tissue type as well. So the cells that make it up have a different function than compact bone tissues. Obviously, they don't serve the same purpose because spongy bone is definitely not there to harden the bone, right? It's really soft and porous. It serves a different purpose, which is to make blood and all this other stuff that we'll talk about when we get to the skeletal system. But this is its own tissue, actually. This is actually reticular connective tissue. So I'm going to talk about that on the back of the flashcard too. So this single slide actually has two tissues in it, bone tissue, reticular connective tissue. Technically, remember, if this bone was actually manufacturing blood, a process called hemopoiesis, there'd also be blood tissue in here. So organs can have multiple tissues in it. That's just what I want you to keep in mind. And look, see this right here? This is actually the bone is being fractured. The bone tissue is being fractured. So there's a break on this slide. So let's write a couple other things down on the back of our flashcard and we'll be done with bone. So this is the name of the specific tissue is bone and reticular connective tissue. So both. The main tissue type, again, is connective. Location on the body. Well, obviously on your skeleton. Or on or in your skeleton, I should say. And then what is the function of it? Well, why do we have bone? Lots of reasons. Support. Whoops. Structure. To make blood. To manufacture blood cells. What else should I put? You know, the other, obviously we have blood. Our bones allow for muscles to attach. Oops. Muscles to attach. Okay, so that's it for bone and reticular connective tissue. So we had a 2-in-1 there, but it kind of makes sense because that flashcard also had multiple pictures on it. So we are on our last one, I believe. Yes, we are. Our last connective tissue. And this one, I really apologize. This picture looks absolutely terrible. If you look at it through the microscope, it looks so much better because there are like little bubbles in this tissue that you cannot see. So actually, I'm going to get my purple marker back out here. There are little circles that you should probably put around these dots. You can kind of faintly see them, but the quality of the picture is just so bad. If you Google image search some of these tissues, you'll see it way better. What you're actually seeing here is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage almost always has this purplish-like look that I have seen in histological slides. And hyaline cartilage is very similar to bone tissue because hyaline cartilage is that part that makes up the center of your rib cage. And it's really hard, right? If you're hitting your chest right now, right? It's hard just like bone. But it is a little bit softer. It's a little bit more flexible. So instead of having calcium and phosphorus, we actually have these protein fibers here, which allow for a little bit more flexibility. So yeah, these still have these little cavities though. It has lacuna cavities. That's what these circle things are. Lacuna. And then the bones, or we don't have bone cells this time. I'm going to make them a different color just so that we can, I mean, they do look purple, so I probably should have, I'm going to make them blue. I'm just going to color in some of those dots because those are the cells that I'm referring to. But this time they're not bone cells, they're actually cartilage cells. All right, so these are cartilage cells, which have a special name, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, I mean, that's essentially what hyaline cartilage is. It's very similar to bone. It's some cells, not that many of them, floating around in this protein, this kind of elastic protein. I mean, it is hard to remember, again, kind of more like plastic though, right? Excuse me. If you think about the difference between like plastic versus rock, right? Plastic is just a little bit more flexible, and the same is true for hyaline cartilage. So if I scroll down here, I'm gonna go to black. All right, so this is hyaline cartilage. I don't, unfortunately, have slides of the other types of cartilage, elastic or fibrocartilage, just hyaline. Main tissue type is connective. Location on the body. It's only found in 3 spots on your entire body. Hyaline cartilage is found in your rib cage. Whoops. It's found at your joints, at the ends of all of your long bones. And it's also found on the bridge of your nose. I had to think there for a second. So right at the top of your nose, not the lower part of your nose, right? The flexible part, that's obviously elastic cartilage. But right where your nose meets between your eyes, so you can feel it's really hardened up there, that's that's hyaline cartilage. And hyaline cartilage is also there for support and structure, just like bone was. But it has flexibility. The other thing that's unique about cartilage, though, is it's avascular. And I know you couldn't really see that in the bone, too, until I drew it. If I go back, remember, if I go back to this slide, I drew all these little perforating, these little blood vessels going throughout. But there's definitely blood supply going through bone. There is no blood supply going through cartilage. And actually, you probably know that because if you ever got your ears pierced, it's not the ear itself, the cartilage within the ear that's bleeding if you get a piercing, it's the skin. The cartilage in your ear has no blood in it at all. So I think that's kind of, that's interesting to me, I think. So, all right, other important notes. Joel, just a couple things I put on there. So let's do that. We got a Lasuna again. And then the little dot inside of it, that thing has a special name, and it's called a chondrocyte. A cartilage cell is called a chondrocyte. So I think that's pretty much it. That's it for our epithelial tissues. So we covered our connective tissues. We covered all the ones that we have in our flashcards. And we have one video left, and I'll cover that in just a second. Those are the 3 muscular tissues, and that will be all of them. So with that, I am going to end this, and thanks so much. Stay tuned for the last video.